this video, we're going to talk about the higher order component or HOC pattern in React. This is a pattern that has been around in React for years, and although it isn't necessarily used as much today as it was previously, especially now that we have hooks and even server components, it's still a pattern that is very important to understand when to use it, how to use it correctly, and also to understand when not to use it. So in this video, that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, before we get into that, I just want to mention that if you like the way that I teach in my videos, I want you to know that I also have a course that is everything that I know about React packaged in a really cool custom application that you get to build, and you actually get to build a really big and complex project, and you're guided every step of the way. If that sounds interesting to you, you can check it out. It's called Project React. It is going to be the first link in the description. Let's get into the video. So we have the HOC pattern. This is the article that we're going to be reading today. This article, by the way, comes directly from our newsletter, Import React, which is completely free. You get it delivered to your inbox every single week. You can also find that in the description below. I highly recommend it. You get articles like this and more every single week, completely free. Again, it's a no-brainer in the description. This is an article that you find on patterns.dev, which is actually a great resource for design patterns in React. They have a couple more than this that are also super interesting to also read. So we have the HOC pattern. Let's begin. So within our application, we often want to use the same logic in multiple components. This logic can include applying a certain styling to a component, requiring authorization, or even adding a global state. One way of being able to reuse the same logic in multiple components is by using the higher order component pattern. This pattern allows us to reuse component logic throughout our application, right? So React is all about reusing things, creating reusable components, and the higher order component pattern is a great representation of that principle. A higher order component, HOC, is a component that receives another component. The HOC contains certain logic that we want to apply to the component that we pass as a parameter. After applying that logic, the HOC returns the element with the additional logic. Say that we always wanted to add certain styling to multiple components in our application. This is a pretty common use case. Instead of creating a style object locally in each component each time, we can simply create a higher order component that adds the style objects to the components that we pass to it, right? Simple enough. So here we have the with styles component. This receives a component as props. This is the children that is going to render. And then with the props over here, it just creates the style object and then passes the component over here, passes the style, and then spreads the rest of the props, right? So you're using this to actually wrap a component and inject it with this style object over here. And this is how you use it. You create a button component. This is a component. It returns a button. We have the same thing for a text. And then you create a styled button, and then you do with styles and you pass it the button, and the same thing for the text. And now both of these components are going to receive the style object, and they will have the style applied when you just wrote it in one component. You just have one component, one wrapper component, higher order component, and you're reusing it for multiple components that you want to have the same style. We just created a styled button and a styled text component, which are the modified versions of the button and text component. They now both contain the style that got added in the with styles higher order component, right? That's great. Let's take a look at the same dog images example that was previously used in container/presentational pattern. This is another pattern that they have on the website. We haven't seen this, but again, you'll find the link to this and you can check it out yourself. The application does nothing more than rendering a list of dog images fetched from an API, right? So this is the actual images over here. We just have a list of images and they're all used and rendered from the actual API. Nothing fancy there. Let's improve the user experience a little bit. When we're fetching the data, we want to show a loading ... screen to the user. Instead of adding data to the dog images component directly, we can use a higher order component that adds this logic for us. Let's create a higher order component called with loader. A higher order component should receive a component and then return that component. In this case, the with loader hook, higher order component, should receive the element which should display loading until the data is fetched. Simple enough. Let's create the bare minimum version of the with loader higher order component that we want to use. So we have with loader, it takes in an element and then returns a function with the props and then calls that element. At this point, we haven't yet done anything to the actual element component. We're just simply rendering it through this wrapper. However, we don't just want to return the element it received. Instead, we want this element to contain logic that tells us whether the data is still loading or not. To make the with loader HOC very reusable, we won't hard code the dog API URL in that component. Instead, we can pass the URL as an argument to the with loader HOC, so this loader can be used on any component that needs a loading indicator while fetching data from a different endpoint. This is a great example of passing props and using a component to be reusable. With this component, we have with loader, the element, and now we have a URL. As long as we pass any element here, any component, and any URL, we can use the with loader and we can put the same logic in here and it is going to work. That's the beauty of React, and that's the beauty of creating reusable components. A higher order component returns an element, a functional component, props, and then the actual function body in this case, to which we want to add the logic that allows us to display a text with loading as the data is still being fetched. Once the data has been fetched, the component should pass the fetched data as a prop. So here we actually have an example. So we have the with loader over here. This is the code element URL. We're returning props, right? And then we have in here some actual state for the data. And then we have a use effect over here, which fair enough, it is using use effect. I would have loved to see React query, but maybe that's besides the point. Essentially, we're fetching some data. And then if we don't have data, we're just returning a div that says loading. Otherwise, if we have data, right, we're returning the element with its original props, and then we're injecting the data property there directly. This is a great example of a higher order component because you're taking something, you're adding extra logic to it, and then you're enhancing the actual component that is being rendered with actual improvements, right? We have this data property here, which this element did not have. This comes from this higher order component. Perfect. We just created a higher order component that can receive any component and a URL. In the use effect hook, the with loader hook fetches the data from the API endpoint that we pass as the value of the URL, right? Simple enough. While the data hasn't returned yet, we return the element containing the loading text. So that's this right here. If no data, return a div that says loading. Obviously, simplified example, but you could literally do anything that you want in here. Once the data has been fetched, we set the data equal to the data that has been fetched. Since data is no longer null, we can display the element that we passed to the higher order component, right? So again, this gets the data, right? And then once we have the data from the response, sets it in the state. And then if we no longer have null as data, we can render the element with the data property, right? There you go. So how can we add this behavior to our application so it'll actually show the loading indicator to the dog images list? So in dogimages.js, we no longer want to just export the plain dog images component. Instead, we want to export the wrapped with loading higher order component around the dog images component. So over here, we have export default with loading and then dog images. This is what you export from the dog images component. Let's see if they actually have it here, because I think that they should. Yeah, there you go. We have the dog images component. It just takes props.data.message and then maps over them. And then for everyone, just renders an image here with the actual dog image. And then at the bottom here, we're exporting, instead of exporting dog images, we're exporting with loader and then passing dog images, the component, and then the URL to get our data from, right? This is only going to work with the with loader because we're depending on props.data, and this is only passed with the with loader component. So that's also important, right? If you're doing this, you have to make sure that you're actually using this. Otherwise, you're going to have errors in your application. The with loader HOC also expects the URL to know which endpoint to fetch the data from. In this case, we want to add the dog API endpoint, right? Exactly. This is what we did. Fair enough. Since the with loader HOC returned the element with an extra data prop, dog images, in this case, we can access the data prop in the dog images component, right? There you go. That's exactly what we did over here. Pretty simple, straightforward. Perfect. We now see a loading indicator when the screen, while it's being fetched, while the data is fetched. If I just click it over here, we should see a loading screen for just a moment once it transpiles the modules. Can we refresh this? We should see, it's probably pretty fast, but I guarantee you this code actually works and we should see a proper loading. Composing. We can also compose multiple higher order components. Let's say that we also want to add the functionality that shows a hovering text box when the user hovers over the dog images list. We need to create, we need to create a HOC that provides a hovering prop to the element that we pass. And based on that prop, we can then conditionally render the text box based on whether the user is hovering over the dog images list. So here we have another component with hover, right? It takes in an element, returns the same props, the same function, and then we have hovering as a state variable. And then here we're just passing the hovering prop to the element, and then on mouse enter, we're setting the state to true. On mouse leave, we're setting the state to false. We're doing that logic in this component, and then we're passing the value of the hovering state to our element through its props as well. Same concept, just a different application, different implementation, and different logic. But we can now wrap the with hover higher order component around the with loader HOC. Right, so over here, dog images, right? Where is it? We have with loader, with hover. If I scroll down here at the bottom, there we go. We have with hover and then with loader, and we're passing doc images and then the actual URL. So now we're doing it 2 layers. We're using 2 components, with hover and with loader, and we're wrapping each component. And you can do this with higher order components because that's what they do. They take components and they return components. So you can use them together because everything that they take and that they return is always a component. So you can use a component that it returns in another hook and it just works. The doc images element now contains all props that we pass from both with hover and with loader. We can now conditionally render the hovering text box based on whether the value of hovering is true or false. Right, there we go, perfect. Now we're into hooks. Let's see how hooks come into this entire thing. In some cases, we can replace the higher order compiler with React hooks. And honestly, in my experience, in most cases, you can also do that. You can use hooks to achieve the same functionality in what I would argue is a better API. Because although this is nice and you can completely wrap those, if you have 2, 3, 4, or 5 layers deep of higher order components, things can get very messy and you have to do this every single time you want to use all of those. It's not necessarily the best approach, and hooks is, in my opinion, a better and more modern approach to doing the same thing. Let's replace the with hover higher order component with a use hover hook, right? So now you can see how this is going to get interesting. Instead of having a higher order component, we export a hook that adds the mouse over and mouse leave event listener to the element. We cannot pass the element anymore like we did with the higher order component. Instead, we'll return a ref from the hook that should get the mouse over and mouse leave events. So let's see that. So we have use hover over here. This is our custom hook. So we have use hover. We have the same state variable over here. Then we have the ref, which we use ref for, and then the same functions, handle mouse over, handle mouse out. And then we have this use effect, which gets the actual node of the ref. And if we have a node, we just add this to the node as an event listener. On mouse over, run this function. On mouse out, we run this function as well. Same functionality, just a slightly different API. The use effect hook adds an event listener to the component and then sets the value hovering to true or false, depending on whether the user is currently hovering over the element. Both the ref and hovering values need to be returned from the hook, right? So there we go. I didn't see it because I scrolled, but we are returning the ref and then the hovering state to be able to use in the parent of whoever uses this custom hook, right? You have to do that, that's important. Ref to add the ref to the component that should receive the mouse over and mouse leave events, and hovering in order to be able to conditionally render the hovering text box. Then, instead of wrapping the doc images component with the with hover higher order component, we can use the use hover hook right inside the doc images component without any wrapping, right? So we have doc images, and then we get hover ref and then hovering from the use hover hook, and we can just pass the ref directly to our div that we want to have this functionality in, and then we have access to the hovering hook, so when we hover over it, we can display our hovering div, right? Same functionality, again, slightly different API. And in my opinion, this is better. I like this more. Perfect. Instead of wrapping the doc images component with the with hover component, we can simply use the use hover hook within the component directly. Now, generally speaking, React hooks don't replace the higher order component pattern. That is very true. You still need the higher order component pattern, but in a lot of cases, you can get by using the hooks, and the hooks is actually a more modern and more simple approach to doing the same thing. See, as the React docs say, in most cases, hooks will be sufficient and can help reduce nesting in your tree, right? With higher order components, you introduce a lot of nesting. As you can see here with auth, with layout, with logging, and then the component, you can do the same thing with hooks without having all of this nesting, and you probably should. Using higher order components makes it possible to provide the same logic to many components while keeping that logic all in one single place. Hooks allows us to add custom behavior from within the component, which could potentially increase the risk of introducing bugs compared to the higher order component if multiple components rely on this behavior. So let's see some best use cases for higher order components and then for hooks. So for higher order components, the same uncustomized behavior needs to be used by many components throughout the application. The component can work standalone without the added custom logic, right? That makes sense. The best case for hooks. The behavior has to be customized for each component that uses it. The behavior is not spread throughout the application. Only one or a few components use the behavior. The behavior adds many properties to the component. Fair enough. Let's now look at a case study. So some libraries that relied on the HOC pattern added hook support after the release. A good example of this is the Apollo client. Apollo client, if you don't know, is a great library for working with GraphQL in your React applications. One way to use the Apollo client is through the GraphQL higher order component. So here we have input HOC, and let's see, we have GraphQL from React Apollo. We're importing it here at the top. Then we have this input component. It's a class component, which kind of shows you what higher order components usually were used for. And then at the bottom over here, we're exporting default GraphQL and then add message. This is the syntax of the actual GraphQL, the actual query that we're trying to run, and then the input component, right? Same principle. This was a higher order component. With the GraphQL higher order component, we can make data from the client available to components that are wrapped by the higher order component. Although we can still use the GraphQL HOC currently, there are some downsides to using it. When a component needs access to multiple resolvers, we need to compose multiple GraphQL components in order to do so, right? Fair enough, because we had to pass here the add message. If we wanted to pass any other endpoint or any other query, we had to wrap this with another GraphQL endpoint, wrapper component, and pass our actual endpoint or query that we want to fetch. This could get messy, and this is nested components. After the release of hooks, Apollo added hook support to the Apollo client library. Instead of using the GraphQL higher order component, developers can now directly access the data through the hooks that the library provides. Let's look at an example that uses the exact same data as we previously saw in the example with the GraphQL component. This time, we'll provide the data to the component by using the use mutation hook that Apollo client provides for us. So over here, we have the use mutation hook from Apollo/React hooks. And then instead of wrapping it here at the bottom, we're not doing any of that. We're just exporting the default input component. We have the same functionality here with the use mutation hook. We're passing add message over here and then any variables that we want. And then we have the function that we can call somewhere in this component. On click, add message. There we go. Same functionality, different API. No need to wrap anything. This is cleaner. By using the use mutation hook, we reduce the amount of code that was needed in order to provide the same data to the component, right? That's one of the many benefits of hooks. You use the same thing, just less code to provide the same data to the component. Besides a reduction in the boilerplate, it's also much easier to use the data of multiple resolvers in a component, right? So if we wanted here another one, we could just take this, we can paste it. I'm not sure I can edit this directly, but you could just paste another hook, pass it here something else instead of add message, pass different variables, and you would also have a function that you can call without the need to wrap anything. Instead of having to compose multiple higher order components, we can simply write multiple hooks in the component. Knowing how data gets passed to the component is much easier this way and improves developer experience when refactoring components or breaking them down into smaller pieces. Pros. Using the higher order component pattern allows us to keep logic that we want to reuse all in one place. This reduces the risk of accidentally spreading bugs throughout the application by duplicating the code over and over and potentially introducing new bugs every single time. By keeping the logic all in one place, we can keep our code dry, do not repeat yourself, and easily enforce a separation of concerns. Now let's look at some cons. The name of the prop that an HOC can pass to an element can actually cause a naming collision. So back to the with styles one that we saw in the beginning of this article, if we have a component, so we're doing the same thing, we're passing the style to the actual component over here, the style, but if the actual component itself already had a style prop over here, this style prop would get overridden because we're doing here, we're passing the style over here. Actually, in this way, it's not the component style would actually override the styles that we have here because we're spreading the props that we get after the style. So even though we put the style here, even though we set padding 0.2 and margin, it is going to get overridden by the style over here because we're spreading it after that, right? So that is a naming collision. And this is one of the cons of using higher order components. In this case, the with styles HOC adds a prop called style to the element that we pass onto it. However, the button component already had a prop called style, which will be overridden, right? I think he means, right, this one will be overridden. I think we're talking about the same thing. Make sure that the HOC can handle accidental naming collisions by either renaming the prop or merging the props, right? So this is what you do. You take the style prop, you define it, and then you also merge the props.style, and then this is going to have the same intended effect. We're going to have style over here, and even though this style is going to get overridden by this property, I think this still has the same bug, if you really think about it, because we're spreading the props afterwards, and the style here is going to override this even though we have the style property here. So this is actually a bug. This is incorrect. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I'm pretty sure that this is incorrect. which is funny, right? But again, the principle remains. If you want to do this, you have to consider this case where you can have naming collisions, and you have to handle it accordingly, hopefully in a way that doesn't really introduce a bug and kind of defeats the whole purpose of doing this thing. When using multiple composed higher order components that all pass props to the element that it's wrapped within them, it can be difficult to figure out which higher order component is responsible for which prop. But nonetheless, even though we mostly use hooks, I still feel that it's very important to at least know about the higher order component pattern, because you're doing similar things in similar architecture when you're just creating normal components in your React application. Sometimes I create components that just wrap other components through props, do some extra logic, and don't necessarily pass those props to the children, but still do extra logic that I want to reuse in the separate components in the different parts of the application. That is something that is similar to what you would do with a higher order component. So it's still really important to know and understand the pattern of higher order components, even though in most cases, again, you should prefer to use hooks instead. They do the same thing, they have less code, and they have less risk for bugs. So there you go. I hope that you've enjoyed this article. I hope that you've learned something from this article. I definitely did, and it was a great refresher for me to see different examples of higher order components. And this, again, is still something that I use sometimes in my applications, not necessarily directly like this, but the concept that it represents, I use. But I also definitely use React hooks as well, and so should you, right? So again, I really hope that you've learned something from this article. And if you want this article, you can actually read it yourself. It's going to be linked in the description, or subscribe to the newsletter and get this delivered for free in your inbox every single week. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos just like this one, make sure to leave this video a big thumbs up. You can also click here to subscribe, or you can click here to watch a different video of mine that YouTube seems to think that you're really going to enjoy. And with that being said, my name has been Darius Kozin. This is Kozin Solutions. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.